Welcome to the Weekly Roar, coming live from the Lion's Den, helping new managers become great leaders and awesome bosses. And now, here's your host, Greg Storch.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Lion's Den. This is the Weekly Roar. Today we're going to continue the recap of our next two lessons learned in leadership. During this Leadership Lessons mini-series, I'm sharing the recap of two lessons learned each week from my last series, Lessons Learned in Leadership. Since that series started well over 6 months ago, I wanted to go back over those lessons in a Reader's Digest fashion and bring back the highlights for you to keep those lessons fresh in your mind. So this week, we're rewinding the clock back again and going back to November of 2020 and talking about lessons 7 and 8. Now, before we jump into that, allow me to introduce myself. I'm Greg Storch, owner of Lion Enterprise, host of the Weekly Roar, and the founder of a worldwide bartered coaching program called The Helping Hand. I'm a certified professional leadership coach and a certified leadership speaker and trainer. Oh, and as a friendly reminder, you can find all of these video resources on my website at lion-enterprise.com. Just look for the Lion's Pride Library and check them all out. Okay, let's start with the 7th lesson that I shared with you, and I called that one, Find Your Own Swim Lane. What that lesson was all about was the importance of finding and working in our strength zone in order to be able to reach our potential. Now, during this lesson, I challenged the participants to tell me one of their strengths. Now, most found it a challenge to come up with even just one. See, the fact is, a lot of people find it difficult to toot their own horns and tell others what makes them special. In fact, a lot of people don't know what their own strengths are in the first place, much less how to talk about them in a confident way without sounding egotistical. Now, during that lesson learned, I shared that most people actually have no clue what their strengths are, and without that knowledge, it's difficult for them to reach their unique potential and find out what they're really meant to do. You see, if we don't identify our strength zone so we can operate in it consistently, we may find ourselves performing tasks that aren't aligned to our talents and skills. And when that happens, well, we become ineffective. If you joined me for this lesson, then you may have noticed that I didn't mention anything about identifying our weaknesses. Now, while it's important to know our areas of weakness so that others can fill in those gaps for us, the thing that's more important is focusing on our strengths. But people who spend most of their time improving their weaknesses and ignoring their strengths will never be on a path to reaching their full potential. They'll become mediocre at best. Regardless of how we define our own success, achieving it will be damn near impossible without knowing what our strengths are and working within our strength zone. I said that during this lesson because our purpose in life is really connected to our unique gifts. We don't get called to do something we have no talent for. When we discover our strength zone, our own swim lane, and when we stay in it, we give ourselves the best chance to discover our purpose. So during that lesson back in November, I shared 3 reasons why having an awareness about your strengths can help you. The first one was because it's just a great way to know and accept yourself. I said that there are a lot of people who don't recognize that their unique qualities can be their strengths. They take those characteristics for granted, or they play them down by saying things like, "Oh, that's just me being me," or "I've always been that way." Or sometimes we just dismiss or hide our strengths because maybe we've been told at some point in our lives that our way of being isn't acceptable, or we aren't good enough. Maybe your gift, your strength, has been minimized or even criticized by influential people in your life. So you tend to hide those things from other people. When you accept and develop your differentness, it becomes an asset, a unique thing that actually makes you valuable to others. Strength awareness helps us to recognize and embrace who we are at our core. Now, the second reason why having an awareness about our strengths can help us was that our strengths have a way of helping us stay motivated and energized. Have you ever noticed that when you're doing what you love, that time seems to just fly by? Hours pass in what feels like minutes because you're pursuing your passion. It happens to me all the time when I'm working in my creative zone, making graphics or editing videos. When we do what comes naturally to us and when we've completed the task, we realize that even though we might be physically tired, we're still full of this inner energy that comes from our sense of accomplishment. That happens because we get fed on a deeper level when we're using our strengths and we're aligned with our purpose when we're using our unique gifts and talents. Finding your swim lane and staying in it will help you create more motivation and energy. And then that third reason why having that awareness of our strengths is helpful was because when we have that awareness, it helps us release the need to be good at everything. The truth is, we can't be good at everything, but we can excel at certain things. So when we focus on what we naturally do well and develop those talents and skills, we release the pressure to excel at everything. During that lesson, I warned you not to take pride in being a jack of all trades, but a master of none. The authors of the book, Strength-Based Leadership, reminded us that if you spend your life trying to be good at everything, you'll never be great at anything. And while our society encourages us to be well-rounded, that approach inadvertently breeds mediocrity. In addition to sharing those 3 reasons why it's important for us to gain better awareness around our strengths, I also shared 4 simple suggestions that were designed to help you get started on tapping into your strength zone. And that first suggestion I made was to ask you what you do well. Now, take note that there's a difference between asking what you're doing well and what you're doing right. When you ask yourself what you're doing well, that helps you focus on your talents. And while we should always try to do what's right, it isn't going to tell you anything about your talent. And then that second suggestion I made was to be specific. I shared that when we think about our strengths, we can tend to think too broadly, but when we get specific about our strengths, the better the chances are that we can find our sweet spot. And then that third suggestion I made was to listen to what others have to say. We shouldn't take our talents for granted. Sometimes when we're good at doing something, we assume everyone can do the same things just as well. In order not to skip over a possible talent or skill, keep your ears open and listen to what others are saying. If you identify something that you're doing that tends to draw praise from others, pay attention to that and start developing it further. And finally, that fourth suggestion that I made in that lesson was to look around and take notice. What I wasn't suggesting was to compare ourselves to others, but what I did suggest is that we are not wasting our time doing things that others can do much better. Remember, we may not be able to be better than they are, but it's possible to be different. And that's what will set us apart from the competition. Being more intentional about understanding your strengths will help you move in the direction of the life and work that you were born to do. And by the way, you may be in the right place now in your current position. And if so, with these insights, you may just need a tweak or two. So, as the final reminder about this lesson, if we really want to discover our purpose, we should begin by exploring our strengths. Remember, our purpose in life is tied to our giftedness. That's the thing we're really good at. So find your swim lane, get in that strength zone, and keep doing the things you're great at doing. When we do that, we give ourselves the best chances at success. Okay, so the following week, I presented lesson number 8, and I called that one Time for a Reality Check. Now, that lesson was all about the importance of facing reality, even as an optimist. Optimism and pessimism sit on the opposite ends of the spectrum, and in the middle lies realism. If you remember this lesson, it was the one where I shared the story of Navy Admiral James Stockdale, who was an aviator during the Vietnam War. Here's a quick recap of that story. Back in 1965, Admiral Stockdale's plane was shot down over a small village. When he landed, he suffered several broken bones, and he hit the ground and was captured and taken as a prisoner of war to a camp that's known to many as the infamous Hanoi Hilton. The Hanoi Hilton was known for the brutality of its prisoners. He was there for almost 8 years. Now, from the very beginning of his capture, Stockdale refused to cooperate with his captors. And after being caught, urging other POWs to resist, he was taken to another jail block where he was frequently tortured. He spent 2 years in heavy leg irons and 4 years in isolation. Stockdale survived what many others didn't, and he was ultimately awarded the Medal of Honor back in 1976. When he was asked how he survived something that many others had not, his response was the true essence of the importance of facing reality. He said, "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." Good leaders must be able to think forward and form a vision. They have to identify a destination or a target that they want to achieve with the help of others. Casting a vision as a leader requires us to think in positive and optimistic ways. It requires that we even consider things that may not be commonplace or reality at the moment. And while following a vision is critical, every leader must also be realistic. They have to be able to deliver reality checks when the situation demands, just like Admiral Stockdale had to do. One of our primary responsibilities as leaders is to define reality. Now, that lesson was one of the more difficult lessons for me to learn, especially for those of us who naturally think positively. Many of us are just wired to provide hope and encourage others, but sometimes we have to look reality in the eye and accept it. Now, for this lesson, I reminded those of you in the lion's den that day that if we lack realism today, then we just might lack credibility with others tomorrow. The reason why I encouraged you that day to consider a more realistic view of things and told you that it's one of the most critical things a leader must do is because at the end of the day, we're responsible for others and they depend on us. We have to be able to define reality, and that means embracing realistic thinking. Realistic thinking helps us see the consequences of our actions clearer than those around us. What we do or don't do as leaders always has consequences. We all know that. But if we continue to attempt to maintain an unrealistic outlook, we're going to ultimately pay a price for it. I shared this great quote during that lesson from Peter Drucker. He said, "A time of turbulence is a dangerous time, but its greatest danger is a temptation to deny reality." If you remember, this was the lesson where I shared my own personal story of working for that IT company in the DC area. It was a great example of how when leadership fails to correctly define reality, they not only hurt themselves, but others as well. Ultimately, people lost jobs, teams got broken up, and friendships were damaged. But the thing I highlighted in that story that I told was that the owner of the company was a very optimistic person. She was super high energy and almost seemed to view the world through rose colored glasses. Unfortunately, I think they got in her way of seeing the reality of the situation. In the end, the CEO's inability to face the reality of the situation ended up costing her that contract. The contract that employed many people at her company, and the loss of revenue resulted in having to let go of a lot of employees. In that real life example, how when a leader avoids being realistic and fails to understand their responsibility to define what reality truly is, it can cost them a great deal. Now, even though I know most of you have a natural tendency to think the best of every situation, just in case you might lean towards being overly optimistic to the point that you don't consider the reality of a situation, I shared 4 quick things that you could do to help defend against thinking unrealistically. The first thing I shared was to get a reality check by admitting your weaknesses. Once we do that, we can start to get better. We can't define reality if we aren't willing to face it first. Then the second thing was about the importance of who we choose to surround ourselves with. Birds of a feather flock together, and while it's comforting to hang around people who are just like you, we need people who fill our gaps and provide strength where we're weak. Then I went on to share the third thing that required an ego check, and that's because I urged you to ask for others to be honest with you, and sometimes that's hard to hear. You've probably heard me say it before that you don't need to surround yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear. You need to surround yourself people who will tell you what you need to hear. That can be hard to do, but it's also necessary if you want to be able to see reality. And then the last thing I mentioned that day was to consider getting an outside opinion. It's amazing how much we don't see when we're comfortable and familiar. Having somebody outside the organization come in and observe and provide feedback can be a really useful tool that I've used in the past, and it proved invaluable in helping me make needed adjustments in areas where I couldn't see because I was just too close to it. So again, if you struggle a little bit with your optimism getting in the way of looking at and defining reality, then I urged you to try those 4 things to help guard against it. Now, the big question of that day was how we can practice realistic optimism in our own lives. And my answer was that it begins with intentionality. We have to become intentional about mixing our optimistic and realistic perspectives. In other words, combine our positive attitude with an honest evaluation of the challenges that we might face along the way. Good leaders face reality and make changes accordingly. They don't dwell solely in optimism or pessimism, but they have a healthy balance between realism and optimism. And facing reality is not synonymous with pessimism either. Pessimists tend to believe that bad situations are their fault. They'll always happen to them and affect everything in their life. They also view good things that happen as a fluke, and they aren't caused by anything that they've done. So, as I wrapped up that week's lesson, I encouraged everyone to remember that the way we define reality determines where and how we lead. And where and how we lead determines where our followers end up. There's a lot depending on it. All right, everyone. There's this week's recap of the 7th and 8th lessons learned in leadership. The importance of finding and working in our strength zones in order to reach our potential, and also the importance for leaders to balance their optimism with reality. I hope you enjoyed that quick recap. If you want to keep running to the roar, then join me next week as I continue these micro lessons in review and recap the 9th and 10th lessons learned in leadership. All you have to do is just come on back to the Lion's Den next Wednesday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Thanks, everybody, for supporting me and watching the Weekly Roar today. I appreciate you, and till we meet again next Wednesday, remember, be powerful, but stay poised just like a lion. Bye, everybody.
Thanks for watching the Weekly Roar live event at lionenterprise.com. If you enjoyed this video, please tell others to join us each week here in the Lion's Den. Thanks again, and see you next week.